Okay, I'm starting on page 420, bureaucracies as implementers, sorry. Implementers to implement is to carry out, to actually, do the job. Bureaucracies are essentially implementers, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, of policy. They take congressional, presidential, and sometimes even judicial pronouncements and develop procedures and rules for implementing policy goals. They also manage the routines of government, from delivering mail to collecting taxes to training troops. So, what's implementation mean? Public policies are rarely self executing, they don't carry out themselves, they're pieces of paper. Congress typically announces the goals of a policy in broad terms, sets up an administrative apparatus, and leaves the bureaucracy the task of working out the details of the program. In other words, the bureaucracy is left to implement the program. Policy implementation is the stage of policy making between the establishment of a policy, such as the passage of legislative act, the issuing of an executive order, the handing down of a judicial decision, or the promulgation of a regulatory rule, and the result of the policy for individuals. So if all that sounds really confusing, everything that I'm going to read here will explain it. At a minimum, implementation includes three elements: creation of a new agency or assignment of a new responsibility to an old agency. So you make a law and you either create an agency to enforce it, or you hand it off to an agency that already exists. Translation of policy goals into operational rules and development of guidelines for the program. Okay, we have a law, it has goals, but how do we, what are the rules, and how do we carry it out? And so getting more specific in the actual day-to-day work. And then coordination of resources and personnel to achieve them. So resources, money and people, in order to carry out the actual day-to-day operations that carry out the rule or the policy goal. But this gets really difficult, and it doesn't always work well, and there's lots of people to blame. The best laid schemes o' mice and men, gang aft agly, will often go awry. So too with the best intended public policies. Policies that people expect to work often fail. High expectations followed by dashed hopes are the frequent fate of well-intended public policies. Analysis reveals that implementation can break down for any of several reasons. So a law is created, great idea. Think of COVID rule, all this COVID money, the CARES Act. There's going to probably be a third one here soon. Congress makes this law, Congress makes this act. Now, where does it fall apart? Where are the failures? So we're going to talk the negative here. It doesn't always fail. But you'll hear, oh, why did so-and-so get, PPE funding, or why did it work that way? Why did this break down? Okay, one reason implementation can break down is faulty program design. Congress overwhelmingly passed a bill to guarantee health insurance to millions of Americans when they change or lose their jobs or lose coverage. Yet the law has been ineffective because insurance companies often charge these individuals premiums far higher than standard rates, and thus they cannot afford the insurance. My guess would be this is COBRA. So if you are fired, laid off, or quit, you can continue to pay for your health insurance. I believe it's up to 18 months. But those premiums are very high for COBRA. And so it's kind of disincentive to want to actually continue that health insurance program. The design was flawed. Lack of clarity. Congress is fond of stating broad policy goal in legislation, so very generic, and then leaving implementation up to the bureaucracies. Members of Congress can thus escape messy details and place blame for the implementation decisions elsewhere. Such was the case with the controversial Title IX of the Education Act of 1972. This Title IX and some other parts of this law, this Education Act of 72, have really changed meaning since 1972. Okay, so Title IX. No person in the U.S. shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So if the school gets money from the federal government, they have to follow this rule. This law, because almost every college and university receives some federal financial assistance. The law forbade almost all colleges and universities from discriminating on the basis of gender. Interest groups supporting women's athletics convinced Congress to include a provision about college athletics. Congress directed the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, today Education, because remember this is back in 72, to publish regulations implementing the law with reasonable provisions considering the nature of particular sports. Okay, but what does this mean? Proponents of women's athletics thought it meant that discrimination against women's sports was also prohibited. Some, with good reason, looked forward to seeing women's sports funded on an equal footing with men's. To colleges and universities with big-time athletic programs, and to some alumni, however, the vague language called for equality in golf and swimming, not men's football and basketball programs, which could continue to have the lion's share of athletic budgets. The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare developed a 30-page interpretation that recognized that football was unique among college sports. If football was unique, then the interpretation implied that male-dominated football programs could continue to outspend women's athletic programs. Supporters of equal budgets for male and female athletics were outraged. A 100-word section of a congressional statute, that's law, written law, that's a statute, had prompted a 30-page interpretation by the bureaucracy. And the statute and its interpretation in turn prompted scores of court cases. Policy problems that Congress cannot resolve are not likely to be easily resolved by bureaucracies. Another example, I showed you that Betsy DeVos, Secretary of Education, her interpretation of sexual assault, it's under one of these titles. I don't know if it's in the Education Act. I don't know if it's Title IX. It may have been a different title. A different section. Her interpretation versus the more liberal interpretation under Obama about how colleges and universities had to handle and proceed with alleged sexual assault cases. I don't know which one's right or wrong and which one is fair or unfair. The problem here is the universities often feel caught in the middle. That they are, depending on the president, depending on the Secretary of Education, the interpretation of the law can change. And that has real consequences. And so here, the law is vague enough, not specified, which you could argue, how can they specify every single portion of a law and what's coming in the future? For example, right now, sex and gender and transgender, that wasn't discussed back in the 70s under the Education Act. So the bureaucracy is left to implement the specifics, which can cause problems. Got it? So bureaucrats receive not only unclear orders, but also contradictory ones. James Q. Wilson points out that the Immigration and Naturalization Service was supposed to keep out illegal immigrants, but let in necessary agriculture workers to carefully screen foreigners seeking to enter the country, but facilitate the entry of foreign tourists, and to find and expel undocumented aliens, but not break up families, impose hardships, violate civil rights, or deprive employers of low-paid workers. Quote, no organization can accomplish all of these goals well. especially when advocates of each have the power to mount newspaper and congressional investigations of the agency's failures. So everyone, his point is picking on the bureaucrats, picking on the men and women carrying out the law, but they're caught in the middle because Congress asked for competing actions that are competing interests. And how do you expect us to do A and B when A and B conflict? I would argue that's the problem with education too, this education law, that it's easy to pick on Department of Ed for what it does, but it's often caught in the middle of how to actually implement what Congress wants. And therefore, the agenda of the president comes into play. Similarly, Congress has ordered the National Park Service to preserve the environmental quality of national parks and to keep the parks accessible to tourists. This is, if you follow national parks and the rules about where tourists can go, can be an issue. The Forest Service is supposed to help timber companies exploit the lumber potential in the national forest and to preserve the natural environment. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Regulation, and Enforcement is to meet the nation's energy needs by leasing tracts for exploration and collect the government's share of oil and gas revenue while also regulating the industry. It is not surprising that the former goal, supported by the energy industry, became the agency's primary objective. And that gets back to interest groups. Remember talking about interest groups and the iron triangles or sub-governments. That's what this last sentence is referring to. But again, in the media, in the news, you will, or from posts from interest groups, all these competing interests within the bureaucracy are going to fight and be found to be fought over by interest groups in the media. And so lack of resources. So first we've got the issue of lack of clarity and them making a decision, and different interests have different opinions. Different presidents have different goals. But here's the big one that many don't talk about: lack of resources. As noted earlier, we often hear the charge that bureaucracies are bloated, too big. This is a key sentence to me. The important issue, however, is not the size of the bureaucracy in the abstract, in general, but whether it is the appropriate size for the job the bureaucracy has been assigned to do. As big as a bureaucracy may seem in the aggregate total, it frequently lacks the staff, along with the necessary staff training, funding, supplies, and equipment to carry out the tasks it has been assigned. In recent years, for example, the news has been filled with stories of serious problems, many of them ongoing. So here's some examples. U.S. troops in the war in Iraq had insufficient numbers of body armor and armored Humvees and trucks to protect them against roadside bombs. After the invasion of Iraq in March 2003, the U.S. had too few troops to devote to fighting the Taliban. Although 80% of the nation's drug supply and half of its medical devices and food are imported, the FDA lacks the personnel and computer systems to identify, much less inspect, the plants producing these items. Because of a lack of personnel, a Social Security admin takes well over a year to process claims for disability. Many people talk about disability fraud, Social Security Administration, disability fraud. People file for it and they don't deserve it. They get a lawyer and they file for it, but the Social Security admin would say, we don't have the resources, the money to follow up to find the fraud. The Fish and Wildlife Service can only consider a very small fraction of the warranted petitions to protect endangered species. ICE lacks the personnel to track most of the millions of aliens who overstay their visas or engage in suspicious activities. The ICE also lacks the resources even to identify, much less deport, more than a small percentage of the 200,000 convicted criminal aliens in the U.S. So ICE has to pick and choose. Under Trump, it had one goal, and under Biden, it'll have a different goal. They can't do everything because of limited resources. So they have to pick their priorities. National Guard units have only a third of the equipment they need to respond to domestic disasters and terrorist attacks. This was the issue with sending the National Guard to the Capitol during the changing of administrations, inauguration. When they sent National Guard to protect the inauguration, they were told, I don't know if this actually really happened, but the fear was, or the thought was, National Guard is also protecting vaccine distribution. So if you go get your vaccination, you'll see there's National Guard there. Well, they can't be in two places at once. Department of Homeland Security could not deploy new machines for detecting smuggled nuclear bombs because the U.S. had run out of a crucial element, helium-3. A lack of skilled personnel, the use of outdated instruments, and aging facilities hamper the nation's ability to identify the source of a nuclear weapon used in a terrorist attack. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Regulation, and Enforcement lacks the resources and technically trained personnel to oversee ocean drilling and has to rely on the expertise of those it is supposed to regulate. This is going to be a big one. Who's actually doing the regulation? The people in the government overseeing the business, or the business itself, because the people in government don't have enough resources to regulate. And a good example of that is FDA, Food and Drug Administration. The FDA regulates prescription drugs, but they count heavily on the pharmaceutical industry to provide the evidence of safety and efficacy, that it works, because they can't do that on their own. So they're counting on the businesses themselves. Another one with FDA and is when we have a foodborne illness, whether it be Listeria, E. coli, when something dangerous is out there and it's in our food chain. Often people will say, why didn't the FDA or the Department of Agriculture find that? Where are they? Why aren't they testing our foods? Well, again, going back to this sentence, it's not whether the bureaucracy is big, it's whether the bureaucracy, and in this case, the FDA, has the money and resources to do what American people want. If the American people want food to be regulated and the food chain to be watched by government officials, we have to pay for that. It costs money to do that. It costs money for the FDA. Okay, so why does Congress not simply give the bureaucracies more resources? It's money. Some well-organized interests fight against adding resources to particular agencies because they do not wish to be inspected or regulated and prefer an ineffective bureaucracy. Polluters, coal mine owners, and bankers, for example, rarely welcome inspections. Now, they would argue, of course, polluters is a pretty generic term, but they would argue free market, the government should not get involved. That is a political question. But the interest of whether or not you want the government to regulate and enforce Clean Air Act, water, food, etc., that's political. But it also costs money. Equally important is the scarcity of budgetary resources. Pressures to allocate personnel to direct services, so to point personnel in a certain direction. For example, to the provision of agricultural expertise to farmers, limit the staff available to implement other policies. So if you have a group of 10 people working, they can only do so much, and you're picking and choosing what they're working on. That's an example I used with ICE. You only have so many ICE employees. Where do you want them to best spend their time? In addition, the irresistible urge of policymakers to provide services to the public helps to ensure that the bureaucracies will have more programs that they have resources to adequately implement. In 2010, Congress expanded the FDA's mission for food safety, requiring more frequent inspections of food facilities. It did not expand the agency's budget commensurate with its new responsibilities, however. This is like the mandate blues. Do you remember that from federalism? You tell them to do more, but you don't give them the money to do it. The budget for the agency overseeing offshore oil drilling was basically flat for 4 decades, even as drilling activity in deep water drastically increased and the technology grew more complicated. Finally, in an age when big government is under attack, there are strong political incentives to downsize government bureaucracy. So, in the abstract, we all want, or many want, smaller government. They want, well, when you make smaller government, then there are trade-offs with that, and then you're shrinking personnel and implementation, and then where many Americans then get upset, why is this not being regulated? So we've got so far to review lack of clarity, well, program design, but that was only a small paragraph, lack of clarity, lack of resources, which I would say is a big one, and then now we're at lack of authority. Agencies may also lack the authority necessary to meet their responsibilities. In 2008, we learned that the SEC supervision of Wall Street's largest investment banks was on a voluntary basis. This is during the Great Depression, what helped contribute to it. Arguably, I think you could argue many sides on this. The FDA, which has responsibility for protecting the public from prescription drugs that have dangerous side effects, does no testing of its own and must rely entirely on the test results submitted by manufacturers. I mentioned that earlier. Yet it lacks the subpoena power to obtain documents when it suspects that drug companies are withholding data about adverse drug reactions or misrepresenting test results. So in other words, if they think the manufacturer is giving them false information, they can't demand documents to prove it. It often lacks access to company documents used as evidence in private product liability cases, so lawsuits. Similarly, the Department of Ag lacks authority to close meat processing plants, even those with serious violations of food safety standards. So, hey, they might find that there's a problem, but they don't have the authority to do anything about it. This actually changed with recall. It used to be that, and I don't know the detail, I'd have to look up the details again, but they couldn't recall food if there was a suspected foodborne illness. They had to ask companies, could you please, there was a listeria outbreak in peanut butter a few years back. Please, could you pull the peanut butter from the shelves? Thank you so much. They couldn't make them do it. That has since changed. Now there is recallability with food product. Some agencies not only lack authority, but frequently fail to exercise the authority that they have. So they have it, but they don't use it. The Mine Safety and Health Administration can seek to close mines that it deems unsafe and to close repeat offenders, but it rarely does so. In addition, the fine and levies are relatively small and many go uncollected for years. It lacks subpoena power, a basic investigatory tool, and its criminal sanctions are weak. And this is going to get into the arguments about iron triangles. When there's too cozy of a relationship between a group like Mine Safety and Health Administration, they're too friendly, they might actually have formerly worked for coal, let's say, for example, a coal mine company. They're too connected, too close. They give them too many breaks. That was an issue they found with the up here with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Too closely connected, too friendly with banks and banks, and then they got a little too didn't seem to notice some things that they maybe should have enforced. Many policies are implemented by state and local governments. The federal government may try to influence elementary and secondary education, for example, but it is the state and local governments that provide the actual services. Federal influence over these governments is indirect at best. Other policies, ranging from safety in the workplace to pollution, are implemented by thousands of private individuals, groups, and businesses. With such implementers, bureaucrats are more likely to request, educate, and negotiate than to issue orders and institute legal proceedings. Okay, then we've got administrative routine. And I'm going to stop this section here.